As a Christian, do you ever feel like you're missing something? I don't mean you're missing out on some activity, but do you ever feel as a Christian that there's just something missing from your Christian life? Some secret that you were not let in on, some inside joke that you never got to be a part of. Do you ever feel like, have you ever put a puzzle together? And when you got down to the last few pieces, there were still pieces missing. There's 4 or 5 pieces missing out of 1,000. You've got most of them right, but you're missing 3 or 4 pieces, and you start looking around all over the floor, and you look down into the couch, or you look in your pocket, and you ask the kids if they saw it, and they, of course, they never see anything that goes missing, and you look at that puzzle and you think, man, this is a beautiful picture, but something's missing. I feel like that a lot of times in the Christian life. Now, what I'm not saying here today is I'm not saying that there's something about my salvation that is imperfect. Okay, what Jesus Christ did on the cross, what he finished there on the cross to pay for sins and to offer forgiveness, not only is once and for all, but is perfect. It's exactly what we needed. It's exactly what God demanded. So I believe that I'm fully loved. I believe I'm fully accepted. It's a struggle sometimes to imagine that. But I'm not saying that there's something wrong with our salvation, but I feel as a Christian, something's missing. That if I could find it and put it into my life or put it into my mind, that there would be a completeness and a wholeness of my Christian life or my Christian experience. I'm not saying that I have all the answers for you today, but I do think at the end of Paul's life, and in particular at the end of Paul's letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 through 8, Paul highlights 3 concepts. 3 concepts that when they're missing from our life, distorts Christian living. Look and say, man, maybe someone would say, Matt's a great guy. Well, Matt might be a great guy, but I feel like something's missing. And I think Paul hits on 3 things here that when they're missing, we get disgruntled, we get discouraged, we get disappointed with Christian living. But when they are present, they round out this beautiful picture of who Christ is and what Christ has for us. So join me, would you, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, as we look at the 3 missing pieces, oftentimes, the 3 missing pieces in the Christian life. And I can attest to these myself. He says this, Paul says this to Timothy, "For I, Paul, am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." 3 missing pieces to the puzzle. The first missing piece is this. Missing piece number 1. We are to live and to die for Jesus Christ. We are to live and to die for Jesus Christ. Look in verse 6. He says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come." Paul says here, refers to himself as being poured out as a drink offering. Paul is referring here to the Old Testament sacrificial system. Oftentimes, after placing a sacrificial animal on the altar, the priest would take some wine, maybe sometimes water or honey, but often wine, and pour it either in front of or on top of the burning animal sacrifice. As soon as the liquid, the drink, the wine, would hit the fire, would hit those embers or the hot sacrifice, it would immediately become vaporized and would produce steam. I want you to think about, as a kid, camping out. Or maybe you've camped out over this summer. And at the end of your campfire, after you've done s'mores and hot dogs and, all that great campfire-y kind of things, you take a bucket of water and you pour that bucket of water on those hot embers. What happens? all of a sudden, this steam forms and it just begins to waft higher and higher into the air. Well, at these animal sacrifices, oftentimes water would be added or a drink offering would be added. Steam would be produced, and which symbolically ascended, and it symbolized this upward movement of the sacrifice and the offering into the presence of God. So you get the point? Okay. There's this picture of the steam moving higher and higher into the heavens. And it's as if God is breathing this hot vapor in. He is breathing in this sacrifice that pleases him. Okay. Figuratively then, what Paul is referring to here, figuratively, he's talking about pouring out his life. His life is the drink offering. Okay, who's the sacrifice? The sacrifice is Jesus Christ. What Paul is saying then is, in his living and now soon in his dying, he's going to be like that cup of wine that is poured on the hot embers of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And when his life and his what he's offered Christ and in the righteousness of Christ, as he's offered that to the Lord, these New Testament sacrifices, it wafts into the sky, and the Father breathes in what we've offered, and it reminds him of Jesus Christ, and that pleases the Father in such amazing ways. Paul is being poured out. He's talking here about how all of his life, and we would say probably not every aspect of his life, but Paul has lived in a way where he has tried to be a living sacrifice. I want you to think about Romans 12:1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living sacrifice. And Paul has tried to live his life in such a way that his words, his thoughts, his actions, his commitments, his lifestyle, his life trajectory would be a drink offering poured on the offering of Christ, wafting up into the presence of the Father. And now Paul says this, as I have been living, as I've tried to do in my living to be a drink offering, I will now do as I pour out the last remaining portion of my life. So as I've been being poured out, I am going to have this last opportunity to be poured out. Paul speaks about this on a number of different levels. We already quoted Romans 12:1, Philippians 2:17, this idea of being a living sacrifice. Now Paul refers to his death. He says that in this phrase, the time of my departure draws near. It's interesting, this word for departure is the act of unloosing or casting off the fastenings of a ship where you might, in preparation for the ship's departure. Sometimes we might say of a high school graduate, it's time to spread your wings and fly. One of my other grandmothers, she would often say, Freddie, you need to cut those apron strings. I never really understood what that meant, but my dad explained what my grandma was saying is you need to give your kids more and more freedom. They're adults, let them go. Of course, my dad has done that. But that was a statement that my grandma would make to talk about a freedom from this place to the next place. Paul is referring here to the reality that his death is loosening the bands that confine him to this present world. He speaks about how his death is going to be the process of being set free, where his soul is permitted to go forth, to expand its sails, and begin its eternal voyage in the presence of Jesus. But all of this is in reference to the fact that Paul says that he's being poured out. Paul has, throughout his life, lived in such a way that he lived for Jesus. And now in his dying, he's going to die for Jesus and go be with Jesus. I think sometimes it's easy for us as Christians to forget that the Christian life is not actually about the Christian. My Christian life is not ultimately about me, it's about Jesus. And when I begin to think that my Christian life is about me, that I do my daily devotions for me, that I do my Bible prayer time for me, that I go to church for me, and when the Christian life begins to be about me, then I become the Savior. I become God. And when we say something's missing in my life, yeah, you know what's missing? Jesus is missing. I have eclipsed Jesus in my own thinking. And so I'm living for myself, and I'm making decisions for myself, and I'm thinking about how this election is going to impact me, not about how the election is going to impact the will and the work of God. So my question for you this morning is, who are you pouring your life out for? Are you pouring your life out for you? Are you pouring your life out for your kids? Are you pouring your life out for your political party? Are you pouring your life out for your employer? And I'm not talking about serving. I'm not talking about serving your family. I'm not talking about serving your employer. I'm talking about, are you surrendering? To whom are you surrendering? Why do you do the things that you do? Are you doing it for you? Or are you doing it for Jesus? And what Paul reminds us here is that the Christian life really is about Jesus, not about me. So when I look back at Christian living and I think there's something missing, yeah, maybe Jesus is missing. My challenge for you today is, if that's the case for you, I think you need to ask yourself the question, for whom am I pouring out my life? If the answer is not Jesus, then certainly something is going to feel missing. The second missing piece to the puzzle, puzzle piece number 2, is living by faith and not by sight. Living by faith and not by sight. Look with me in verse 7. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. When Paul refers to the fight here, the word that he uses connotes this idea of the Greek games. And in particular, the wrestling. Wrestling would have been the top dog there. He's talking here about fighting or wrestling in the Christian life. He's talking about strife and struggle. He's talking about agonizing to such extreme levels that our bodies writhe and contort in pursuit of a prize and in the pursuit of victory. So what is Paul referring to? What would he be wrestling with? What are you and I wrestling with? Well, we wrestle against our sin. We wrestle against the values and the priorities of the world. We wrestle with unbelievers, or we wrestle with believers who don't want to follow Jesus. And sometimes that believer is me. We wrestle with the unsaved. We wrestle with them in a spiritual sense to see them come to Christ as they hear the claims of Christ. You might say, well, Matt, when I got saved, I didn't sign up for a wrestling match. Well, that's exactly what we signed up for. You say, well, when did I enter the match? We entered the match upon our salvation. I want you to think about it this way. One commentator said that when you and I received Christ as Savior, a bell rang signifying round one. And ever since then, we have been slugging it out in this wrestling match between good and evil ever since. Sometimes I think as a Christian, we forget, and I forget, that I'm supposed to be actively engaged in the match, not a spectator. Now, the Buckeyes play this weekend. If you're watching this on Sunday, already have played. Hope that was a good outcome. I love being a spectator in college football. The truth of the matter is, no matter how much I talk, there is no chance that I'm ever stepping out at Ohio Stadium and playing one down. I didn't, and now I'm too old probably to do it. But I love spectating. And you know, sometimes in the Christian life, what happens is we forget that we are involved in a death match, right? A wrestling match for good and evil, for life and death. And too oftentimes we step back as spectators. We say, well, something's missing from my life. Well, you're supposed to be out on the field playing, bud. Well, but I like to watch. I like to talk about it. I like to philosophize about it. I like to get a good game plan before I go play. And a lot of Christians get saved, they go to heaven, but they're never engaged in Christian mission. Why? Because they're living by sight, not by faith. It's interesting here when he talks about the good fight, he refers to this fight as noble and beautiful and praiseworthy. The conflict that we are in between good and evil is a noble fight. There is no more noble cause on the planet than seeing people come to faith in Jesus Christ and become more like him. John Piper talks about this fight. And he refers to the end of 1 Timothy. He says that fighting the good fight, which Paul's just talked about, I have fought the good fight, he says is often referred to as fighting the good fight of faith. The good fight of faith. So when we're wrestling with sin and we're wrestling against the world and we're wrestling with other believers and we're wrestling with good and evil, it's actually not just a fight, a striving. It's a trust fight, right? It's a faith fight. It takes faith to fight our tendency to see the world not through our physical eyes, but through the eyes of faith, through the lens of the Scriptures. It takes faith to fight a real enemy. Sometimes as Christians, we misjudge who the enemy is. We think other Christians are the enemy. We think the government is the enemy. We think the unbeliever is the enemy, and that's not true. Government's not the enemy. Politicians not the enemy. Marriage isn't the enemy. Not someone who disagrees with me. That's not my enemy. Who's my enemy? There's three of them. The flesh, which is inside of me, my sin nature. The world, talking about the world as it is dominated by Satan and demons. Okay, so we fight not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of darkness. And we fight our own tendency to sin. We fight our own tendency not to live and die for Jesus, but to live and die for our own self. So we say, well, something's missing in my life. Well, maybe what's missing in your life is you're not engaged with Christian mission. You're living by sight and not by faith. I think Tuesday, there's going to be an opportunity for you to self-diagnose the match that you're engaged in. I believe that our response to the election and the election results on Tuesday will reveal much about where we are in this. Who are you trusting for the future of your children? Who are we hoping for a better life? Who do we think is in charge of life anyway? Who do we think controls the universe? Now, I'm not saying that we are disinterested in what happens on Tuesday. I'm not even saying that you can't be disappointed in what happens on Tuesday. And in some way, we're all going to be disappointed in some degree on Tuesday. But as a Christian, you have one day to be disappointed. And maybe not even that. You hear the results, you chalk it up to the sovereignty of God, and guess what? You get back to work. And I don't mean necessarily your 9 to 5. I mean you and I get back to Christian mission. The reality is the elephants and the donkeys aren't going to fix anything because they can't fix sin. They can't fix the human soul. They can't bring hope of any lasting quality. But you know who can? Jesus can. And he's called you and me to partner with him to be on Christian mission in this good and noble fight for life and death. So we say, something's missing. Well, maybe something is missing. It might be Jesus. You've eclipsed Jesus by making the Christian life about you and how we feel. Or we've lived by sight and not by faith. We've gotten distracted and we've taken our eyes off of who is really in control of this. And so we're not engaged. I mean, we're wrangling and wrestling. We're striving, but not on Christian mission. The third missing piece, I think, often to the puzzle that Paul refers to is here in verse 8. He says, "Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Missing puzzle piece number 3 is living with eternity in mind. Living with eternity in mind. Paul here talks about a time that he's going to see shortly, but he hasn't yet seen. He says this, "Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness." He believes there's a crown of righteousness laid up for him, but a crown he's been promised, but he's not actually yet received. Why? Because Paul is focusing here on his future. Paul here in this verse is future focused. Future focus. It has enabled Paul throughout his life, being future focused, has enabled him to meet the present persecutions and sufferings with perseverance and a blazing hope. Imprisoned in a dank, dark dungeon facing death, Paul sees beyond the visible temporal injustices and indignities forced upon him to the invisible future which promises an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. 2 Corinthians 4:17. What are we saying? Paul keeps the faith. Paul walks by faith, not by sight. Paul makes it about Jesus because there is a coming day where he will stand before Jesus and give an account. And Paul says his future hope for reward keeps him focused and motivated here and now. Now, I can imagine, maybe you're sitting at home watching this, saying, "Well, you just said that we should be motivated for the glory of Jesus. This is all about Jesus." And it is all about Jesus. But it is interesting how often not only Jesus, but the New Testament writers sweeten the pot. It is for the glory of Jesus Christ, and it is for you in your best interest to follow Jesus Christ here and now. God's good is intricately tied to our good, and our good is intricately tied to Jesus' glory. Listen to the number of passages that speak to being motivated by future reward. Matthew 6:19-21 says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust and destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." How about Mark 10:29-30? "No one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me," Jesus says, "and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, and in the age to come, eternal life." Listen to how many parables speak to future reward. In Matthew 29-16, the parable of the vineyard workers, the gift of salvation is symbolized by 1 day's wage, something to be experienced and gifted. In the parable of the virgins, the reward is a marriage banquet, and we'll have the marriage supper of the Lamb. In the parable of the talents, the reward is described in general terms. Being put in charge of many things, he who is faithful will share in the master's happiness and be given greater reward. In the parable of the servants, the faithful servant is rewarded by being put in charge of all of the master's possessions. Luke 12:42-44. In the parable of the pounds, the trustworthy servants are given authority over cities. Luke 19:16-19. Jesus promised the 12 disciples that they would have authority over the tribes of Israel. Matthew 19:28, Luke 22:30. Members of the church in Thyatira in Revelation 2:26-27 were promised authority over the nations. Hebrews 11:6 says, "Anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists and that God rewards those who earnestly seek him." Matthew 5:12 says, "Great is your reward in heaven." Matthew 13:44, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field." Jesus and Paul are very clear that we are to have a motivation for reward. Clearly, Paul believes in personal reward as a legitimate, God-ordained motivation for Christian living and service. For sure, we do it for the glory of Jesus. And when we do it for the glory of Jesus, Jesus pours out reward upon the believer. And I'm going to tell you something. I waste a lot of my life pursuing reward here and now. I do. Praise, adoration, ease, convenience, all these things. Paul here refers to a specific reward. He says, henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also, and that includes you and me, to those who have loved his appearing. Can you imagine being with Jesus someday and he says, I watched your life, and I know that for the most part of your life, you sought the glory of my name and my gospel. And you lived in such a way and you spoke in such a way that you loved my appearing. You loved being with me and wanted to be with me further. And as a result, I'm going to give you the Stephanos, a type of trophy. Of course, we're going to hand it back to Jesus. Why? Because he gifted us salvation that made this possible. He has given us the Spirit as a guarantee to make this possible, an empowering presence. And we'll give it back to Jesus, but how amazing will it be to hear, you did a great job, Matthew. You know, I'm 42 years old next week. No, 2 weeks, I'll be 42 years old. To this day, there is nothing in my life as valuable to me as when I hear my mom or my dad or one of my sisters or my wife say, boy, Matthew, that's a great job. There is nothing in my life more valuable than hearing, boy, you did a good job, Matthew, from the people that I love the most. Now, imagine, and maybe you didn't get that from your biological parents or by anybody in your life, but could you imagine what that would mean for you then? Well, imagine what it's going to mean when Jesus, our Savior, says that to us. Or imagine what it will be like when he can't say that to us. Listen, that ought to motivate us. We say, something's missing in my life. Yeah, living on purpose, right? Looking to live a life with a future eternal focus in mind. My question to you on this point is, do you love Jesus? Do you show it by delighting in and obeying his word? You can enhance and enrich that eternal reward by faithfully serving Christ now. And that's why Paul said, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do it with your whole heart for the Lord. He says in Colossians 3:23 and 24, whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord, you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. By loving and serving Christ with all your heart, you'll enjoy eternity as Christ expresses back to you his gratitude for your service. He will do so by enhancing your service and responsibility beyond what we can imagine right now. And you'll know the fullness of eternal joy as you serve the one who gave himself for you. So is there something missing in your Christian life? Does it feel like there's a missing piece or two? Well, my question is, who are you pouring your life out to? And are you pouring your life out for Jesus Christ, making Christian life and life about him? The second question is, are you living by faith and not by sight? And meaning that the good fight is the fight of faith, that we're engaged in Christian mission, not by sight, but by faith. Are you engaged? And third, are you motivated? Not by temporary reward, but by eternal reward. It not only means eternal reward in heaven, but it changes the way we experience the joy of life in the here and now. When we take our eyes off of, here again, I hate to bring it back to the election. If you go into the election with all of your hope riding on one party winning or another, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it's going to be miserable. The next 4 years are going to be horrible for you, or they're going to be so elevated in ecstasy that in 4 years you're going to go through another round of anxiety. But those who see God at work behind the scenes and for eternal purposes will experience Tuesday, maybe some slight disappointment, maybe some slight excitement, but then gets back to work knowing that we're not working for the here and now. We're working here and now for the there and then. And it will be worth it all when we see Jesus. So as you look back at your life, the missing pieces leave us disenfranchised, leaves us disgruntled, leaves us discouraged. Why? Because we've distorted the purpose of the Christian life. To make it all about Jesus, to live by faith, trusting, engaged in Christian mission, knowing that our reward is eternal. Blessings to you.